final days, new revelations about the chaos and confusion and real worries about an attempted coup.
We had a crazy, delusional, authoritarian, dangerous president of the United States.
Plus, can Democrats unite around Biden's plan to reshape the American economy?
We're going to get this done. We are getting this done.
Yet another budget-busting socialist package, twice as big as the last one.
And pot politics. Top Democrats want to legalize marijuana, but the president isn't on board yet.
This bill is urgent. This bill is long past due. Lives are being destroyed every single day.
Inside Politics, the biggest stories sourced by the best reporters now. Welcome to Inside Politics Sunday. I'm Abby Phillip. It was even worse than we thought. That is the takeaway from the first big books about the final year of the Trump presidency, written by some of the top journalists in the country. The scariest part so far, General Mark Milley, the president's top military advisor, worried that the outgoing president would stage a coup to stay in power. That's according to the Washington Post reporters Carol Leonnig and Phil Rucker, who write, Milley described to aides that he kept having this stomach-churning feeling that some of the worrisome stages of the 20th century fascism in Germany were playing out in 21st century America. They may try, but they're not going to effing succeed, he said. President Trump denied it, more or less, saying, I never threatened or spoke about to anyone a coup. And if I was going to do a coup, one of the last people I would want to do it with is General Mark Milley. Even after these revelations and many others like it, though, most Republicans here in Washington remain silent. Joining me now with their reporting and their insight, Tolu Olorunipa of the Washington Post, Politico's Rachel Bade, Jackie Kucinich of the Daily Beast, and NPR's Tamara Keith. So this is really obviously extraordinary, but of course, after 4 years of the Trump presidency, I think a lot of people can become numb to what we are hearing about in all of these accounts. The consistency of it, though, is really astounding. And it is shocking to me, I think, as we sit here, Jackie, that there is, it seems, no outrage among a lot of Republicans here in Washington about what is being said about the former president, who they also say, by the way, is the leader of their political party.
Because he's the leader of their political party, and they are linked to him both from a ideological standpoint at this point and from a fundraising standpoint. I mean, let's just get down to the politics of this. You couldn't get closer to that day than on January 6th than Kevin McCarthy, who was on the phone with the president asking him to call off his supporters. And yet, who was at Bedminster just this week meeting with the president again. And so, and has very much tied his potential future speakership to the former president. So there's no getting away from it. And I think this is one of the reasons that we didn't have a commission, an independent commission, to investigate what happened on January 6th, because Republicans just want to put this behind them and keep plowing forward.
It could be easy for a lot of people to think that this is just Milley being dramatic and that this was all about rhetoric and comparing it to Nazi Germany. But there was also a worry, according to Susan Glasser, writing in The New Yorker, about what Trump would do as it relates to Iran. She writes, it was not public at the time, but Milley believed that the nation had come close, very close, to conflict with the Islamic Republic. Milley feared it was Trump's Reichstag moment in which, like Adolf Hitler in 1933, he would manufacture a crisis in order to swoop in and rescue the nation from it. So, I mean, Tamara, how close did we get?
I don't think we know exactly how close we got. We know that Mark Milley, that General Milley, was worried about it. And we know that he wants everyone to know that he was worried about it because it is showing up in these books and it's showing up in these accounts. And we also know that there was a letter from, or an open letter from former secretaries of defense right before January 6th, making it clear that they had concerns. And when that letter first came out, I was like, whoa, do they know something that we don't know? It turns out they probably did know something that we didn't know.
Yeah. And we should mention that a lot of people that cooperate with these books, they get their side of the story out. And this is what we're seeing.
There's a lot of legacy preservation in these books, or attempted legacy preservation.
Speaking of which, a lot of people I don't know that some people are necessarily trying to launder their reputation, but there are people who are being described in the book who behind the scenes know that what is going on is insane. And publicly were saying other things. One of those people was the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. According to Michael Bender, he writes in his book that Pompeo said this: the crazies have taken over. He warned a colleague, he conveyed the concern to others that Mr. Trump might be more willing to engage in an international conflict to strengthen his political argument for remaining in office. A couple of days after this election was called for Joe Biden, here is also Mike Pompeo publicly.
At what point does a delay hamper a smooth transition or pose a risk to national security?
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration.
What are the consequences for these folks?
Clearly, he was trying to convince himself, it seems like, more than other people. But no, I mean, when I'm reading these excerpts, my number one takeaway on this is, where were these people right after January 6th? I mean, clearly there was a second impeachment. There was a moment there where the party almost froze for like a week, maybe even less, where people were Republicans were genuinely trying to figure out, what do we do? Do we turn our back on him? Do we stick with him? How bad is this? And there were a lot of people who could have come forward and potentially changed, the projection of the Republican Party in that moment. And, people like Pompeo, people like Milley, you have to ask, why didn't Democrats subpoena some of these people? Could it have made a difference?
That is a good question.
And, I guess we'll never know. But clearly the revelations are just now starting to come out about January 6th and the before, the aftermath. We're going to learn a lot more. But what would have happened if it all came crashing down in those weeks after? We'll never know.
And you think about a lot of people preserving their legacy. A lot of people are also trying to preserve their political futures by not crossing Donald Trump, by not saying that he should have been impeached, or by not, speaking on the record about what was happening behind the scenes. A lot of them are happy to talk to book authors, but they don't want to talk in public and say that the crazies have taken over, or that what former President Trump was doing at the time was crazy. He was essentially trying to, rally up his supporters and get them to, try to take over the government. So there aren't too many people that are willing to say that on the record, but and that's in part because they want to be able to preserve their political future.
And Mike Pompeo's in Iowa.
Well, yes, who else is talking? Who else is talking to book authors? Former President Trump. He cooperated with so many of these books, and you have to wonder, what is he thinking?
I know what he's thinking. Well, I think I know what he's thinking. He has thrived on attention his entire life and his entire political career. And if they're talking about him, if we are on a Sunday morning talking about Donald Trump, then he feels like he is winning. No matter what you're saying, it's the oxygen that attention provides.
And, we always have to, I think a lot of people in this day and age, they're saying, why do we keep talking about Trump? Why do we keep talking? Well, because people thought that he was going to have a coup. I think that's an important thing to kind of debrief. And I think it also has present day implications because, as you pointed out, McCarthy went to Bedminster. He says that this was a meeting about 2022. He says it was all about the Republicans' electoral future. But it seems highly unlikely that it was not also about the big lie that Trump still wants to push.
Yeah, I mean, Republican leaders privately are absolutely dreading anytime Trump has a rally right now. They do not want him to talk about this. This is the last thing the Republican Party wants to focus. This is why they're not out there criticizing him right now, even though a lot of them are seeing these excerpts and saying, oh my gosh, it's just as bad as we thought it was. They want to focus on Biden. They're trying to flip the House. They think they've got a pretty good shot. They do have a pretty good shot at flipping the House in 2022, and this is just a hindrance. But just to go back to something you said at the top of the show, this whole idea of the public becoming numb, we have seen this for years now. When it came to, the Mueller report, there were all these little stories that sort of made the public numb, and then the Mueller report comes out. People say, oh, it's old news. Same thing with impeachment. Little nuggets coming out with, the Ukraine allegations and him trying to force a foreign power to interfere in the 2020 election. Those were allegations. And then it actually comes out. John Bolton says it's real, and people say, oh, it's not a thing. It's the same thing's happening with January 6th, where there are these little nuggets. We get pieces of it. People say, oh, just reporting. Right. And then we get the full truth, and not everybody, but a lot of the nation is numb, and so are a lot of these Republicans.
One of the big Trump strategies often is just putting the crazy out there. And if it's just said out loud and people are just talking about it, we get numb to the fact that it's really crazy. This is what happened after the first impeachment, but it doesn't change the fact that these are, deviations from the norms of this country. I mean, it's really extraordinary where we are, but it does make you wonder. Trump is likely to run in 2024 with all of this baggage, and Republicans are 100% on board the train.
They're still doing audits. They still haven't. There are people out there that haven't acknowledged that the 2020 election is over. So it's absolutely still present day, and he's absolutely someone that we have to talk about because he is very much running the show on one of the major parties of this country.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have more coming up. The President of the United States versus Facebook. Why Joe Biden says that the company is to blame for vaccine denialism. President Biden says Facebook has blood on its hands.
They're killing people. I mean, look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated. And they're killing people.
The White House says social media platforms aren't doing enough to curb the spread of vaccine disinformation, but Facebook is striking back and hard. At a time when COVID-19 cases are rising in America, the Biden administration has chosen to blame a handful of American social media companies. The fact is, the vaccine acceptance amongst Facebook users in the U.S. has increased. CNN political commentator Alice Stewart is joining the conversation. This is, to me, extraordinary. For a number of reasons. But let's start with the first, Tamara. The White House is frustrated. It's reflected in what you heard the president say. They're killing people. He literally said they're killing people. What is going on behind the scenes that has gotten us to this point?
Yeah, and he essentially is just putting a finer point on what the administration has come to believe, which is this idea that they have landed on that this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. That is the new phrase that they are pushing out into the universe. Part of that is to try to persuade people to get vaccinated, but part of it, whether they want to admit it or not, is a bit of distancing. Is to say, right, you know, we've been trying to get people vaccinated. You know, the White House says the vaccines are available. What they haven't been able to do is break through with a lot of people who are getting information on social media. You know, I've spoken to medical directors in rural counties in Mississippi and Missouri, and they are just at wit's end. They're frustrated. They can't get their staff even to all get vaccinated. Right. And the reasons they hear are things that people read on Facebook, and they keep mentioning.
Well, Facebook points out, to your point, that the White House missed its own July 4th deadline to get to 70%. Okay, that is true. They may be looking for a scapegoat. That is true. But I do wonder about the tone of this back and forth on Facebook's part, in part because I recall for 4 years, they wanted nothing to do with pushing back on President Trump. They were being accused by conservatives every day of all kinds of things. It's amazing to me that the statements that they put out on Friday and last night again about all of this, it seems like a complete change of tone.
The rhetoric has certainly heightened to a great degree. And look, I think we can all agree that we should all strive to put out factually accurate information on social media, and all social media platforms should strive for that as well. But we also have to realize they're the de facto public square. They are people talking to people, to their friends and people that are like-minded, and they're going to put out information that they truly believe in. And to be honest, a lot of people don't trust the government. And I think the question is, and the fear is, when we have the federal government taking attempts and taking steps to try and censor what is being out there in free speech and out there in the public square. And that's the concern.
I think the question, though, is what happens when it is clearly not true, when they're just lies?
Yeah, well, that certainly needs to be corrected, because we're seeing a lot of people, as you say, vaccine hesitant for many reasons. They don't trust the government. We see African Americans who are concerned about the Tuskegee experiment. We see Catholics who are concerned about infertility. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and I think people would be better served listening to real news accounts, the CDC, and our public health officials, and staying away from these websites and social media sites that do spread misinformation.
One element of this, of course, social media companies. The other element is the political dynamic of this, in which it does seem that a lot of Republicans are taking advantage of vaccine denialism, and certain media companies, namely Fox News, spreading it on their platform. I mean, just take a listen to some of this.
It's just astounding the Democrats would try and mandate this, and it's being done to college students. It's being done at the workplace.
The vaccines, unfortunately, appear to be declining in effectiveness very quickly.
Remember, it was 14 days to slow the spread. That's how this started. And now here we are mandating, apparently, that people get a vaccine.
Oh, by the way, her father-in-law wants credit for developing these vaccines, and yet why is it that this has become some kind of political litmus test?
It's clear that some Republicans sort of see this as they can weaponize this issue to their own advantage, right? They're trying to say that, Biden and the Democrats are going to force you to get a vaccine. They're trying to scare people in the base that perhaps they already have their own hesitancy when it comes to the vaccines. And I mean, that's unfortunate. It's not everybody. You have people like Mitch McConnell who have, clearly and openly talked about getting vaccinated and how important it is. The thing that perhaps President Biden can do differently is maybe, where are these? He's got this big bully pulpit. Where are, the events with Republican leaders where they're literally standing next to somebody who gets a vaccine in their arm? I mean, it's sort of like a chicken and the egg thing, right? Like, is it that people are afraid of the vaccine and they're listening to these conspiracy theories? Or could leaders be doing more, Republican leaders specifically, to talk to people in the Republican base who have these sort of concerns and try to say, no, that's wrong. These are the facts, and do more to work together and show an example.
Well, and I think one of the things that the White House has said they're doing, it's one of the reasons they have this program, and it became like it became like Antifa knocking on your door trying to get you to get a vaccine. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But no, what they actually were doing, they were trying to get leaders from communities, churches, doctors who people knew to talk about the vaccine, to talk about the importance of getting it. And that's one of the ways that they've tried to reach people who aren't reachable by politicians, who don't listen to the media. They were trying to get trusted people involved. And that is one of the ways they're trying to combat this vaccine denialism. But I just wanted to say, when it comes to Facebook, taking the White House out of this, they know this is an issue. They've known this was going to be an issue. In October of last year, they made ads. You weren't allowed to run any ads that had to do with being an anti-vaccine. A lot of medical professionals saw this was going to happen with the COVID vaccine. And it is a question, what else could be done to stop this on social media?
And it's not, I don't think, as much what this administration can say, but what they can do. I think they've led by example. They, throughout the campaign, they social distanced, they wore masks, they used caution with the events they had, and it has paid off. We haven't seen a large number of people in the administration with COVID. I think that's important. But they also realize they might not be the best messengers for this. That's why they're getting, they had Olivia out there this week.
But okay, so when does President Trump, who wants to be credited for Operation Warp Speed, wants to be credited for whatever, when does he step in and play a role in this?
I don't expect that he will, and I don't expect him to be the best person to do that. I think it should be people that are closer to people that need these vaccines. On the state level, they're community leaders, they're health leaders. I talked to Little Rock Mayor Frank Scott yesterday in a ruby red state. He is a Democratic mayor in a ruby red state that has a terrible vaccine rate, and he is out there educating people and encouraging people and using local officials to try and encourage people, and churches and people on the local level that people trust and that people will have confidence in. That's where the message needs to come from.
In Tennessee this week, we saw where this could all head. It's not just COVID-19. They paused communication to parents and children about other vaccines as well. Several of you here are parents. That's really terrifying on some level.
Yeah. It's just, I can't understand it.
But, just like the door knocking that Jackie was talking about, that then became this scary thing, they're coming to get you, a very simple explanation of, yes, vaccines are available for children 12 and up, becomes a very scary thing in the wrong hands. And then that starts affecting policy. And the CDC and others have been very concerned that children are already missing their regular vaccinations. Their schedules are off because of COVID and doctors' offices being closed and parents being afraid. And this it feeds into the anti-vax establishment machine that already existed before.
I think it's a really scary time, frankly, for all of us, because we've eradicated some of these viruses, and it's not a permanent situation if people stop getting their vaccines. But coming up, it's do or die time for President Biden's massive plan to reshape the U.S. economy. The week ahead could be a pivotal one for President Biden's ambitious agenda to overhaul the nation's infrastructure and social safety net. After months of debate and negotiations, Democrats now believe there is a path to get almost everything that they want: a bipartisan plan on physical infrastructure and a Democrats-only bill that includes top liberal priorities like universal pre-K, Medicare expansion, climate change provisions, paid for all with taxes on businesses and the wealthy.
We are, in fact, looking at the most consequential piece of legislation for working families since the Great Depression.
This bill is absolutely a progressive victory.
But the trick for Democrats will, of course, be whether they can hold on to support from their liberal wing without losing support from moderates who are still worried about the price tag. Plus, they have to keep at least 10 Republicans on board for the bipartisan roads and bridges part of the plan as well. So, Rachel, it feels like we are in a completely different place maybe than we were a few months ago. There's a lot of optimism among Democrats. But should they be optimistic about where we are? Can they really make this balancing act work?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Democrats, they realize that now is the time. They could potentially lose the House in 2022. Yeah. And there is a lot of optimism that they can do this. I mean, failure for the Democratic Party right now is really not an option. And I think that is going to drive, and already is driving, a lot of the compromise you're seeing on both the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, but also the Joe Manchin moderates who are worried about this price tag. They've got a lot of ups and downs to go. There's going to be haggling about where does that money go in this Democratic bill? You know, how much goes for, people who are staying home taking care of a loved one, or, how much goes for education. But, again, with this onus, this pressure about we got to do this, I think is really going to drive people. I think the big story this week is going to be on the bipartisan infrastructure side, specifically because there are a lot of Republicans who are unhappy that Schumer has set up a vote, the first vote for this on Wednesday. They don't even have legislative text yet. They're waiting for a CBO report to actually score this bill. They're still concerned about pay-fors. And you're already hearing, some of those moderate Republicans who agreed to this framework sort of say, oh, I'm not sure anymore. So I think that is going to be the big question of the week. Can they do that? Can they land it? And, it's TBD at this point.
I've described this before as whack-a-mole, because that's kind of what it is. It's like you get an inch on one part of it, and then on the other part you take 2 steps backwards. So, I mean, how is the White House looking at this? And are they fine with what Schumer has set up? As Rachel said, this vote that seems pretty aggressive in terms of the timeline on Wednesday.
They seem to be at least publicly willing to say, Congress will manage this the way they want. The leaders over there can do whatever they want to do. They're obviously in very close contact with Chuck Schumer, and Chuck Schumer would not surprise them. That's just not the way this relationship would work. But I've actually described it as you're on a tight wire spinning plates, because there are so many different elements here, and at any moment one of those plates could fall. You could lose some of the Republicans on the bipartisan bill. You could lose Joe Manchin or Chris Coons or somebody. Like it is this really perilous effort to do very complicated legislating, and they do feel like they have a deadline. One, because they're headed into 2022, and pretty soon the moderate Democrats in the House are going to start getting very tense. But also, President Biden seems to be bound and determined to have his entire presidency accomplished in the first year.
I do want to talk about Bernie Sanders for a second here, because this is really extraordinary. The headline in Politico is strange but true. Bernie takes a very pragmatic turn. And Senator Tim Kaine says, we wouldn't be here without him putting out that $6 trillion price tag that everyone was like, oh, no way. But they were like, okay, actually, we're totally fine with like $3.5 trillion.
Shoot for the moon. You can land among the stars or whatever it is. I don't have any spinny plane whack-a-mole analogy for that one. But let's not forget who Bernie Sanders is. He's been around for a really long time. He's been in that body for a really long time. He was in the House for a really long time. He knows how to strike a deal. He has always been to the left of everyone else. Look at even on this voting bill that's not going to go anywhere in the Senate. He said that he was okay with Manchin's compromise, or some gradation of okay. So he's someone who knows that he said as much. He knows how far to the left he is, and that the rest of the party isn't with him. And so he's going to get as far as he can with what he can, and and end up with some wins therein.
A quick note, though, on a different topic. Yeah. This week, DACA was invalidated by a federal court. Democrats want to put immigration in this reconciliation bill. What are the chances of that?
Pretty slim. I mean, clearly the Senate parliamentarian has ruled that increasing the minimum wage federally was out. Basically, any provision in reconciliation has to significantly affect the federal budget, and she gets to determine what that is. But for Democrats, again, it comes back to this idea of why not try? I mean, the base wants this. There is concern about what happens to a lot of these, dreamers. And so, why not try? Tell the base you tried to put it in. Let her be the bad guy, the Senate parliamentarian, and then you can say, okay, we'll try to do something on the back end of another.
Poor woman.
And there is a lot in this reconciliation bill, as you mentioned. There is a lot of Democratic wish list items in this bill. The child tax credit extension, we've already started to see people getting $250 every month for their children. Extending that and making it permanent would be a huge win for progressives. And there's a lot for progressives to be happy with. And Bernie Sanders was talking about some of these things years ago, and they were sort of seen as pie in the sky ideas. And now they're actually becoming law. So progressives have a lot to be thankful for.
It does make you wonder, okay, so how do Republicans run against, like, handing people checks, for example? But this is how, apparently.
8. In the past year, the price of bacon is up about 8%. In the past year, the price of clothes is up about 5%. No matter how you spin it, we simply cannot afford any more Bidenomics. I think the American people will agree all of these prices need to come on down.
Wow. Wow. She loves the slogan.
Pretty fun, yeah.
Yes. I mean, she did run on making them squeal.
Yeah,
but
exactly,
that bacon thing is on
The
brand.
bacon thing is very on brand. But I mean, the inflation issue is not something that the White House is completely ignoring. They're saying it's temporary, but this is what Republicans are planning to run on in 2022.
Absolutely. And the White House is concerned, they are watching and hoping that this is temporary and that this inflation isn't real, but just is a reaction to the pandemic slowdown and now things returning to normal. But you hear Republicans coalescing behind worries about inflation. You also heard Joe Manchin mention inflation as a concern for him when that $3.5 trillion framework was laid out.
And they're also going to have to raise the debt ceiling in the next couple of months, which is going to complicate everything. But just to sort of sum it all up, I mean, speaking of Republicans, if you look at where they were 4 years ago under Trump, there were Republicans saying they would not vote for this and that Obamacare repeal bill. They were a total mess in terms of like threatening their leadership, going around their leadership, wanting this provision, that provision. It's just a totally different feel with this Democratic-controlled Congress. And so because of that optimism, it feels like they're going to find a way. It's just a question of what's in it and how do they get there.
Yeah. Well, lots to look forward to over the next year, because I think the politics of this totally unsettled right now. But coming up for us next, a once-in-a-generation. Widespread protests continue across Cuba over rising COVID cases and deaths and longstanding poverty and repression on the island. It has also exposed a divide within the Democratic Party about how to respond to them. President Biden used his strongest language to date to denounce the Cuban regime.
Communism is a failed system, universally failed system. Cuba is unfortunately, a failed state and repressing their citizens.
So this is all happening in a political context, of course, in which Democrats are looking at what happened in 2020, where Joe Biden's margin over Donald Trump with Latinos was 7%. That's compared to 27% for Hillary Clinton just 4 years earlier. So is this a golden opportunity for Democrats to get the policy right and the politics right on the issue?
It could be, but we were just talking about how progressives are really happy about all of the things in the infrastructure bill. They are really being led in many ways by the progressive wing of their party, and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party does not want to go hard against Cuba, against some of the things that the Castro regime may have been a part of, in part because there are some Democrats, there are some progressives who agree with some of those things. They agree with universal health care. They agree with some of the programs that were in place in a more socialist kind of society. And Joe Biden is trying to push against that. He's essentially trying to say, you know, we do not want our party to head in that direction, because he saw what happened in South Florida in 2020, where, you know, he did very much worse than Hillary Clinton, and Democrats really lost a lot of ground, in part because Republicans were pushing this message that all Democrats support socialism and they support the kinds of policies that will make the United States a third world country. Some of that was hyperbole, but it resonated with a lot of the voters there, and Democrats
South
are
Florida,
trying to figure out how to.
And where in South Florida, where just like in Cuba, there have been protests in the streets this week in support of those protests, and one of the dynamics, to your point about Democrats, is the progressive members like AOC versus members like former Congresswoman Debbie Murcazel-Powell, who lost her seat to a Cuban American over this issue. Listen.
We also condemn the Biden administration's decision to continue to contribute to the suffering of working people across Cuba.
The only government to blame here, the only culprit of what's been happening in Cuba is the Cuban government, which has been a dictatorship.
For those of you who write books, I think this is going to be a chapter in the one about the Biden presidency, about him trying to get his message out when he has this very vocal progressive wing that is saying something that's counter, that could be politically damaging to what the Biden administration and the Democratic Party is trying to do. And I think all they can do is listen, right? Because no one's going to go quiet on the progressive wing and just try to get their message out there louder, because that is going to be used. What Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you can see that being an ad that's going to be used in the 2022 election.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there have been some Democrats who've tried to tackle that head on. I mean, right after the midterm elections, where Democrats lost way more seats than they were predicting, almost lost the House, there were these tense conference calls where they tried to say to their progressive colleagues, stop using the word socialism. And I mean, this is a broader issue than Cuba specifically, but clearly, that democratic socialism is still being embraced.
And defund the police was something else that they were very upset about.
Meanwhile, the Biden administration, their policy here has been kind of to not do anything at all.
Well, they have not yet put their stamp on Cuba policy. It doesn't seem like addressing Cuba policy or modifying the sanctions that President Trump had put in place, or modifying the relationship. It really doesn't seem like that was part of the first 250 days agenda. But once again, this is another one of these foreign policy challenges that has shown up, that wasn't part of the plan, that the administration is now being forced to deal with, to think about, and they're kind of being dragged into it. Right. It doesn't seem like they are eager to put this at the top of the pile.
And maybe they're right, because Americans are concerned about what's going on domestically. They're not as concerned about these foreign policy issues. And Republicans, they want to make this an issue, but it remains to be seen whether it will be something that moves votes. That's outside of South Florida, of course. Coming up next, top Democrats are being blunt. It's time to legalize marijuana.